We've been talking about worldview, and particularly the biblical worldview, in contrast to the worldview of animistic societies and the worldview of secular and materialistic societies. We mentioned the other day the tree, that ideas have consequences, and the roots of a tree are the belief system of a culture, and the trunk of the tree represents the value system that comes from that belief system. The branches of the tree reflect the behavior of the people that comes from the value system, and then the fruit represents the consequences of the behavior and the things that we see in our societies. What we want to do today is give you a practical tool on how you can begin to examine some of the things in your society that are hindering your society, that are keeping it from flourishing, that are keeping it from becoming all that God intends for it to be. We title this lesson and the corresponding work session, The ABCs of Culture, or the Web of Lies. You'll see why we call it the ABCs of Culture in a few minutes, but the Web of Lies is, if you think of the web of a spider that entangles you and keeps you from functioning, keeps you from flourishing. Satan is a liar, and he spins webs of lies that impoverish individuals and nations. I'd like to begin by giving you a couple of illustrations. These come from very different parts of the world, and I'll begin with one from my own country. If you were to drive from Los Angeles, California, across the country diagonally up to Boston or New York, you would be able to listen to Christian radio stations all the way across the country. There's something like 2,000 Christian radio stations. And in all of the major cities, you would be able to watch Christian television. There's something like 200 Christian television stations around the country. There are Christian primary schools and secondary schools. There's Bible schools, there's Christian colleges, there's Christian universities, and there's even Christian graduate schools. There's Christian newspapers and Christian magazines. If you were to color the United States Christian, by color you would color her Christian. And yet today we kill 1.2 million babies a year through abortion. Yet today within the church, the breakup of families is approaching that of the breakup of the society as a whole. Today in the state of Oregon, they've passed a law that allows for physician-assisted suicide. It's nicely called, nicely packaged, death with compassion, or a compassionate ending to life. But what it is allowing doctors to murder their patients. And this trend is only growing in this country. So what's wrong with this picture? So many churches, so much Christian media and communication systems, and yet so much brokenness. What's wrong with this picture? The second illustration is from a friend of mine named Silvio. Silvio, at the time he told me this story, was a nurse. He worked for Youth with a Mission, and he worked on a boat on the Amazon River, and this boat would go up and down the Amazon River. And Silvio was part of a medical healthcare team. And they would get off the boat and go up into the tributaries of the Amazon as far as they could in a canoe, and then if they had to, they would walk further to these very remote villages. And Silvio told me that 35 years ago there were no Christians in this part of the world. These were unreached people groups. But missionaries came in, preached the gospel, and planted churches. And then they would go deeper into the jungle and they would preach the gospel and plant churches. And now all over this region of the Amazon, there are churches and Christians. And Silvio said when he goes into these communities, he is really troubled. These communities are so poor that the men in the communities sell their daughters' sexual services for cash. And he said the thing that really makes him cry is that the Christian fathers sell their daughters' sexual services for cash. What's wrong with this picture? The next illustration comes from a major global missions conference that took place a dozen years ago. There were 2,000 missionaries that gathered from all over the world. And one of the leading missions strategists in the world was tasked with telling the history of global missions. And every day he would speak in plenary session, following the flow of missions around the world. And he started out with a PowerPoint that showed how the whole world was unreached and the church was very, very small. And as we moved through time, the church grew larger and larger, and the numbers of people to be reached grew smaller and smaller. On his last day, he said to the missionaries gathered, "We are the first generation in the history of missions that can see the end of the Great Commission." And that statement sent electricity through the crowd. And they all stood and gave him a standing ovation. To think 2,000 years of missions history. And we now, with the numbers of churches and numbers of Christians in the world, and the fewest number of unreached people groups ever, we now can see the end of the task, and it can be fulfilled in our lifetime. And as a missionary, sitting there hearing that, just to think, I can be part of the generation that completes the task. After he finished talking, the next person to stand up was going to give a case study of how missions had come to her country and had impacted her country. And she came up and told how in her country 100 years before you could count the number of Christians on your hands. There were very few. How missionaries came and preached the gospel and planted churches. And now there are churches all over her country, Christians all over her country. And she said, today 80% of the people in my country profess Christ. And there was wonderful applause. Isn't this a great case study? There were no Christians 100 years ago. Now 80% are Christians. This is a great story. And then she said, do you want to know where I've come from? And there was this long pause. And she said, I've come from Rwanda. And we all know what happened in Rwanda a few years ago. There was genocide. There was a war between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And the Tutsis were the minority tribe, and yet they were the governing tribe, and the Hutus in the majority were tired of being governed by this minority tribe, and they decided to get rid of the Tutsis. So for 3 months, there was a war. And at the end of that 3 months, over 1 million people were dead. 1 million people out of a country of 7 or 8 million in 3 months. And they weren't killed by an atomic bomb hitting Kigali. They were killed by spears and machetes. They were shot. The kind of warfare where you're looking into a person's eyes when you kill them. Neighbor killing neighbor. Christian killing Christian. Is this the end of the Great Commission? I think not. What's wrong with all three of these images? In all three, you see the gospel going out, you see people professing Christ, you see churches being planted, and in all three, you do not see discipleship taking place on the level of culture. There may be discipleship on the level of spiritual disciplines, maybe, where people who profess Christ are taught to pray, to read the Bible, to attend church, and to witness. These are the spiritual disciplines, and they're fundamental to the Christian's life, but they are not sufficient for the transformation of a society. They're not sufficient for the discipling of nations. So we have been very successful at what we set out to do. We've been successful at saving souls for heaven and planting churches, but we have not discipled at the level of culture. And thus we have not fulfilled the Great Commission. I remember being in Rwanda after the genocide, and the lead pastors in the country were planning a new evangelistic effort. And in the conference, I looked at them and I said, "Why are you planning an evangelistic effort? What if 100% of Rwandans profess Christ and they still kill each other?" You don't need another evangelistic effort. What you need to do is disciple at the level of culture. Now, I'd like you to think for a few minutes, what other issues can you see, other situations where there has been evangelism and church planting, but where you have seen very little results? And what does this mean for the task of the church?